Beetlejuice!
Beetlejuice.
Beetlejuice!
What the f?
He's back. After 36 years consigned to the annals of film history, Beetlejuice has become the latest iconic character to receive the legacy sequel treatment. Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is very much a film of two halves, with each half feeling almost like a completely separate movie to the other. The first half relies heavily on the audience's nostalgia for the first film. All of the key ingredients from that first outing are here. Tim Burton's trademark German expressionist-inspired style, the wonderful blend of practical effects, makeup and animation, and about half of the original cast are all on full display. The film opens with a recreation of the long establishing shot that opened the first film, complete with Danny Elfman's rousing and playful score, before swiftly reintroducing us to Winona Ryder's Lydia Dietz, now a celebrity medium, mining success from her unfortunate ability to see ghosts. Like the first film, the sequel takes the time to establish the lives of the main characters in the land of the living, with Lydia uniting with her kooky, social climbing artist stepmother, Delia, and new characters Astrid, her somewhat estranged daughter played by Jenna Ortega, and Rory, her loathsome manager/boyfriend, as they return to the family home from the first film to bury her now deceased father, Charles Dietz. The pacing is largely on par with the first film, which also focused on the lives and afterlives of a small group of characters for some time, before introducing Beetlejuice into the mix later on. The difference is that the first film did this in a more interesting way, as it followed the perspective of a pair of newly deceased ghosts, so the audience was able to learn about the supernatural along with them. In this new film, the supernatural elements are largely divorced from the main characters for the first half of the film, with Beetlejuice appearing more regularly than he did in the first film, but largely doing his own thing in the world of the afterlife, and rarely interacting with the main characters. Something that director Tim Burton always excels at in his films is contrasting his perception of reality with an element of fantasy. He has described himself as regularly blurring the line between the two. In this film, the reality is the land of the living, and the fantasy is the afterlife. He brings both of these to life very well, but I think he keeps them too separate from each other for the first half of this film. The first film blended the two together better by having the ghost characters and the living characters under the same roof. This first half of the sequel also tries a bit too hard to invoke nostalgia in the audience. For me, the nostalgia started to feel particularly forced at Charles Dietz's funeral, where he is buried while a heavenly choir sings. Everyone who has seen the first Beetlejuice will know how entertainingly this song was used in the first film. But just because there's a funny scene featuring it in the first film, doesn't explain why Charles would be buried with it. It feels lazy for this film to be so self-referential without providing a narrative reason to justify it. The nostalgia is further emphasised a few minutes later, when Astrid leaves Charles's wake, riding her bike over the bridge where Adam and Barbara Maitland met their end in the first film. Despite the excessive references in this part of the film, one that I did enjoy was when Delia asks whether Maxie Dean is at the wake, after spending half of the first film trying to get his attention. This film is at its best when it stops trying to milk nostalgia from the audience, and instead takes advantage of its excellent cast and premise to tell its own original story. Thankfully, it really kicks into gear on that front at the start of the second half. More on that later. In my review of the first film, there's a link in the description if you haven't checked that out yet, I questioned whether the filmmakers would have the restraint to keep Beetlejuice as a looming background presence in this sequel, or if they would be tempted to move him front and centre. He does seem to have more screen time in this film, but not a lot more, so they do largely manage to maintain his original threatening presence in the background of the story. The other thing I was curious to see was whether they would tone down his creepy, villainous nature in this film, or keep him as the wholeheartedly vile villain that he was in the original. As it turns out, the writers managed to have their cake and eat it with this one. Beetlejuice's first proper scene in his office in the afterlife reassures the audience that he's still as vile as ever. He takes a call from a bitter dead man whose wife has remarried, and he nonchalantly promises him that he'll kill the new husband, possess the wife, make her do unseemly things, and post the pics. Where his role diverges somewhat from the original film is in the impact that he has on the main characters. He ends up operating as something of an anti-hero in this film rather than a villain, with Lydia successfully persuading him to help save her daughter Astrid from danger. We also have a new addition in the form of Beetlejuice's ex-wife Dolores, hunting him in this film. Changing him from hunter to hunted makes him more sympathetic to the audience than he was in the first film. Making him more of a protagonist, while still maintaining his character, works really well, mainly because Michael Keaton hasn't missed a beat in the last 36 years, so his performance completely lives up to the original. In the first half of the film, he is one of the few returning elements that feels exciting rather than just forcefully nostalgic. The rest of the characters are used with varying degrees of effectiveness. Winona Ryder does a fantastic job of making Lydia feel like the same character from the original, but with 36 more years of experience under her belt. She is still
strange and unusual,
and still having problems as a result of being haunted by ghosts, but she has also learned to use it to her advantage, using her experience not only to become a success, but also to control Beetlejuice for a time towards the end of the film. Catherine O'Hara is still hilarious as Delia. I want to hate her self-absorbed character, but I can't help but love her thanks to the quality of the performance. Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin have been written out of the sequel as Barbara and Adam Maitland, which makes perfect sense as they've aged too much to play ghosts again, who obviously shouldn't have aged a day since their deaths. Unlike Beetlejuice, they don't have the luxury of being hidden beneath excessive layers of makeup and wigs. Jeffrey Jones also does not return as Charles Dietz in this film, unfortunately because of some unpleasant and illegal activity that he's engaged in during the intervening years, according to what I read online, which is a real shame as I loved him in the first film, and in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I'd really prefer not to have to question my morality if I continue to enjoy those performances in the future. Something that really surprised me though is how much Charles still appears in this film, despite the actor not being in it. I thought the writers would just use him as a plot device to bring the rest of the Dietz family together at his funeral, but he surprisingly does keep on appearing throughout the film, with the filmmakers going to some creative lengths to work around the actor's absence, and even give him his own little storyline. I'm also amazed by the calibre of actors that Tim Burton manages to secure to play the smaller supporting roles. Danny DeVito makes a memorable appearance as an afterlife janitor. Bern Gorman delivers every line with perfect comedic timing as the priest Father Damien, and Willem Dafoe can do no wrong, so as you'd expect, he's great as Wolf Jackson, the ghost of an actor who loses himself in the role of an afterlife detective. One actor who is sadly underutilised though is Monica Bellucci as Beetlejuice's deceased ex-wife Dolores. She's awesome, and she has a couple of very entertaining sequences, one being her debut as she gets free after years in captivity, and the other being a brilliantly stylised flashback sequence that reveals her origin. Overall though, she appears so little and has so little interaction with most of the main characters that the film wouldn't be much different if you cut her out entirely. There are two major new characters who have a much bigger impact on the film too. One is Justin Theroux's Rory, Lydia's manager and boyfriend. He is an annoying character, and to be fair, he is clearly supposed to be, and he does have one or two brilliantly funny line deliveries, but overall he is just a bit too unlikable. I can't help but contrast him with Delia, who on paper is not a likeable person, but is played so well that I can't help but love her. The other important new character is Jenna Ortega's Astrid, Lydia's daughter. This is a standout bit of casting. Jenna Ortega is rapidly making a name for herself as the latest in a long line of female actors who specialise at playing dark, gothic, macabre young women. And she's already excelled herself taking over the role of Wednesday Addams from Christina Ricci, so to have her playing a successor to Winona Ryder's Lydia is a no-brainer. The only problem with her is that, like so many elements of this film, I felt like she was being wasted for the first half of it. She has a fairly predictable, ordinary story about clashing with her mother, being a moody teenager, disliking her mother's new boyfriend, and finding solace with a boyfriend of her own. Thankfully, just when I was getting worried that the writers didn't know what to do with her, I arrived at the second half of the film, and the writers expertly pulled the rug out from under me. As I mentioned earlier, the second half of the film is completely different. From here on out, it's far more entertaining, engaging, full of fun surprises, and a lot of world building that expands the view of the afterlife that we got in the first film. And at the centre of it is Jenna Ortega's Astrid. There's a great twist in her relationship with her new boyfriend, which I really should have seen coming, as the clues were there, and it's also been done before in another more famous movie. Don't worry, I won't spoil it. But somehow the filmmakers did deceive me into thinking they weren't going to do anything interesting with Astrid, so the twist really did take me by surprise, and I loved it. I really can't stress enough how suddenly the film goes from bland to super interesting, with the living characters finally converging with the ones who are trapped in the afterlife. Even Rory plays his part in kicking off the second half of the film, as he's the character who finally summons Beetlejuice, and has a great first meeting with him. He also becomes a lot funnier once he's embroiled in the chaos that unfolds once Beetlejuice is reunited with Lydia. So much happens in the latter half that the ending does end up feeling a little bit rushed, as there are a lot of characters converging who all need to have their storylines wrapped up. All in all though, it's really fun. A final thought: given that Beetlejuice's shtick is that he appears in the land of the living to unleash mayhem whenever someone says his name 3 times, and this sequel is called Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, does the title imply that one day they're going to make a third movie called Beetlejuice Beetlejuice Beetlejuice? I'm not convinced it's necessary, but if Michael Keaton's still up for it in another 30 years, I will once again pay to watch him get nuts.
They're gonna make him do this till he's 90.
Indiana Jones recently did a legacy sequel to a legacy sequel, so it's not completely without precedent. Anyway, there aren't enough films like this these days. Just good, light-hearted fun that's well made but doesn't take itself too seriously. I might even enjoy the first half a bit more on a second viewing, now that I know it's laying the groundwork for something good in the second half. So, in conclusion, Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is a tale of 2 movies. The first half has too much forced nostalgia, but the second half is actually pretty good. If you like the characters and setting of the first movie, you'll probably enjoy this one. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and please keep an eye out for the next one. If you have any thoughts about the film that you'd like to share, drop something down in the comments, whether you agree with my thoughts, disagree, or want to call out an interesting point that I missed. Because ultimately, you will have your own relationship with this movie. I am just a third reel.